in addition to setting a value, we can actually animate our focal distance. At the beginning of our composition, we want the focus to start on number 5. So I'll click on the stopwatch to set a keyframe, then modify the value for the focal distance. I know that number 5 is a positive 600 pixels on the z-axis. I know that there's also an additional 600 pixels between 0 and the camera. So I need to add those two together in order to get my focal distance for octopus number 5. By merely changing the focal distance, I change what the camera perceives as in focus. Now I can change the depth of field values for this camera even further using aperture or f-stop. Now these two are linked together, and depending on which one you're comfortable with, you may need to open up the camera preference window in order to change them. If you're familiar with aperture setting, you can set that here by simply clicking on the value to change it or scrubbing it. We'll change our aperture here to a value of 28. Now, if you're more familiar with f-stop, you may want to change it using the dialog box. So instead of changing the aperture here, let's double-click on the layer for the camera and bring up our camera settings. Here we can see there's a dialog box for both aperture and f-stop, but because they are both linked, so by changing the aperture value, we can see that the f-stop has been updated to reflect the difference in their relationship. If you prefer to work in a value other than pixels, you can do that by changing the units value here from pixels to inches or probably millimeters. Now when using millimeters, you can see that all the different values update in the dialog box. However, although we're using millimeters to get an aperture value of 4.9, once we click OK, you can see that the aperture value set inside our timeline is now 14. And the reason for this is that the timeline uses values defined by pixels. We'll click here and change this again to 28 pixels. Once we change the aperture to 28 pixels, we can see that the blur becomes much more apparent as the layers move away from the focal distance. The last thing we want to do for focal distance is animate it. At the beginning of the composition, we'll start with number 5 being in focus, but then closer to the end of the composition, we want number 1 to come into focus. Now I don't want to set it exactly in front of layer 1, but just a little bit beyond it so that it still keeps a little bit of depth there. So rather than changing this to simply 400 pixels, I'll change this to a value of 450. The reason for this, we're working with a layer whose Z position is about negative 200. The distance between negative 200, which is this layer, and negative 600, which is the camera's layer, is about 400 pixels, which is going to be our focal distance. Now with this key set here, if we scrub back in time, we can see the focal distance animating over time. The last thing we'll do is set an easy ease in for the last keyframe on this focal distance by holding down the Shift key and pressing F9. Additionally, there's one more layer that I want to turn on, which is the background. And turn it on. Then with a quick RAM preview, we can see how animating the camera and all of the different properties of the camera will give us not only a 3D composition, but a very dynamic 3D animation.